Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to Show Me the Meaning, Wisecrack's movie podcast.
Show me the fancy sauce.
Hell yeah. What up, everybody? I'm Austin Hayden, and I'm joined by the Show Me the Meaning crew. We've got Raymond,
Hey, everybody, how's it going?
and joining us once again, we've got Michael. What up, Michael?
Oh, it came down from the treehouse with my pirate hat and stack of hustlers ready to go.
Michael is newly married, everybody, so a round of
Yeah,
applause.
congratulations, man.
Now
Thank
achieved
you.
adulthood, which is now relevant for the film that we're going to be talking about today. So you've leveled
Yeah.
up. You've leveled up. Yeah.
My perspective, I looked at this film as someone that had transcended everything these young men were facing, and I related to it from the perspective of the Richard Jenkins character exclusively.
Well, very, very happy to have Richard Jenkins' character joining us on the podcast this week. Sorry, that doesn't mean that Richard Jenkins is actually joining us. For people who are huge Richard Jenkins
He
fans,
is not
love
about
Cabin
to
in the
pop
Woods.
on.
Austin? Throwback?
Yeah, right, exactly. We already talked about it. We're talking about Step Brothers, 2008, Adam McKay film, produced by Apatow and crew. It stars Will Ferrell, John C. Reilly, Richard Jenkins, Mary Steenburgen. Is it Steenburgen or Bergen?
I've always heard Steenburgen.
Virgin, I
Yeah,
think.
Steenburgen. Lover. Adam Scott and Catherine Hahn, who's friggin' fantastic in everything she does. So as always, we're going to go around and do first impressions and things like that. But I do want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. Remember, you can follow us over on Twitter, SMTM_POD. We're releasing like little tidbits and extras and ideas and thoughts, hot takes, etc., pretty frequently on that. So check that out, SMTM_POD. And then make sure to check out our other podcasts, Culture Binge, check out Squanch, go look at our back catalog. Everything contrary to popular belief, we're actually not feuding within the Wisecrack family. Well, how did that drama get started there, Michael? Was there that the Culture Binge people hate the Show Me the Meaning people?
No,
There was some Twitter.
I think whoever runs the Show Me the Meaning Twitter account, and I'm not going to point fingers and name names, I think fired the first shots.
Okay, so that's a producer. So Matt, did you stir up some controversy? Well, Matt can't talk right now.
This is, I think, producer Matt and producer Maddie taking out their internal beef via the avatars of two podcasts.
Amazing. So yeah, make sure you go check that goodness out, and also check out our Patreon. We're releasing bonus content every now and then. We've done some really cool ones. A deep dive on Apocalypse Now. Talked about like the philosophy of acting. Talked about amazing feature debuts, what makes a good feature debut. So go check all that out, patreon.com/wisecrack. That's the housekeeping to the show. Let's talk about first impressions. Now, apparently, Step Brothers is one of Michael's favorite comedy. So, Michael, give us your first impressions and tell us about your experience with Step Brothers, and then what it was like watching it this most recent time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've mentioned this on podcasts before. I am a big Adam McKay head. I think that like Adam McKay's progression from really dumb comedy to kind of thoughtful, satirical things to subversive comedy into more serious work is kind of mirrored, I don't know, shifts in my own interest and perspective. But I'll say this. I loved Anchorman. I loved Talladega Nights. When Step Brothers first came out, I didn't rush out to see it. I had heard bad things. This was 2008. Around the time of my life, I was going to meet Austin, actually. And it was a time in my life where I wanted to be more serious. I would say that when Step Brothers came out, I had lost my dinosaur a little bit and thought that I had to give up my dinosaur to be a serious philosophy boy. And
yeah, philosophy grad school will do that to you.
Yeah,
a little bit.
It really did. I was more like trying to watch French films.
2008. Yes, Melancholia and shit like that. Everyone's talking about Antichrist. 2009. It's all about Von Trier and fucking Malick.
Like,
yeah.
Adam McKay doesn't even know what Dogma 95 is. But so I watched it probably 2010, 2011 for the first time on DVD after everyone said it was horrible and lost my mind. Just thought it was one of the funniest things I'd ever seen. I've probably watched it as much as I've watched any comedy in the past decade. I think it's the gift that keeps on giving. And I think that it's both brilliant for what it is, but scary for what it, I think, predicted about the unconscious or conscious mind of a certain type of American male that was I think, coming to the forefront during the Bush era. So I think that I think there's a reason the movie is just aged better and better. And doing a little Google today, you look at the early reviews, all bad. Almost no one liked this movie when it first came out. Maybe someone else. I'll save a fun review we can talk about later if someone wants to bring that up. But you look at now, like there was so many articles at the 10-year anniversary of people being like, "Oh, actually, this movie is really good," and people's perspective changed on it. All that to say is, didn't see it when it first came out. Blew me away the first time I saw it on DVD, and I still really love this movie. And I had so much fun rewatching it today.
Yeah. All right, Raymond. What about you, brother?
I co-sign everything Michael said. Saw this one in theaters when it came out, and I think I have been singing Derek's verse from Sweet Child of Mine for the past 13 years now. That's been stuck in my head. I love this movie. It's kind of my favorite type of comedy. We talked about this a little bit before we started recording. Movies like this, or Dumb and Dumber, or MacGruber, or A New Leaf are just my favorites. Or like The Jerk is kind of the classic example of this, where there's a main character that's just a little bit off, and there's no diagnosis. They're not terribly concerned with like what's animating that. They're just like presented as they are, and the movie doesn't necessarily judge them for that. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but Michael, you bring up how Adam McKay's career has sort of evolved, but I think this kind of exists really, really neatly within the themes that he's been exploring throughout his career. Certainly something we could unpack later on, but this is yeah, I mean, I love it. I would probably say the same as Michael. This is maybe my most rewatched comedy of the past decade. And when I first saw it, I had a good time. I laughed, but it did actually, it certainly grew on me on rewatches. And then the unrated cut came out. And now that to me is like the version of the movie that I know. Like I know that fancy sauce was not in the theatrical cut, at least not as I recall. Little things like that seem to have become a major part of everyone's like sort of shared memory of this movie. I think this movie, like Michael said, did kind of take the time on DVD to become more and more of like cult status, if you will. But yeah, excited to talk about it and unpack the deeper meaning, because I actually think there is a whole lot more on the bone than most folks would give this movie credit for.
Can't wait to hear about it.
Well, cool. Well, then I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna play the foil, and I'm gonna be like, meh.
Wow.
Like, yeah. I mean, like, is it funny? Sure. Do I laugh when I watch it? Sure. I don't know. Like the first time I saw it, it was one of the things. It was the opposite for me with Michael. I had heard a lot of hype. Like, you got to see this. It's freaking hilarious. So the first time I saw it, I was like, yeah, it's funny, but it didn't like blow me away. Like, I remember the first time I saw Superbad, I fucking died. I was like, this is fucking hilarious. And I think part of it was because I was studying at a Christian university at the time, so it also felt really like transgressive, because I was a part of like the non signing of the party line kind of crew at the university where I went. You know, we were kind of like, we lived off campus, and, you know, we drank and we didn't quite follow all the rules, sort of thing. And so then Superbad for me was like the pinnacle. So I was like really hoping that Step Brothers would kind of give me a similar kind of like freedom type of feeling, and it didn't really do it for me. So I was like, okay, whatever, like, it's funny, but it didn't really didn't blow me away. And then on repeated viewings, I've enjoyed it more, but I'm kind of like, yeah, like, okay, like, it's fine, it's funny. I much prefer Adam McKay after he separated with Will Ferrell. Like, I'm really looking forward to Don't Look Up. I hear it's really good. I love his films that he's done since. Succession, I know obviously Jesse Armstrong was the writer of it and the creator of it, but McKay had kind of production and a little bit of oversight, and talks about like his involvement in it. Like, that style, I just think that stuff is much more in my wheelhouse for what he's doing. And maybe that's not fair to kind of like critique this film based on what this artist has done subsequently, but like, it just doesn't fully do it for me. So even on this watch, and I'm going to play the role of super soft soy boy liberal, and I'm going to say, you know what? This film's fucking problematic. Like, dropping F-bombs and R-bombs, and I don't mean the fuck word, but I'm like, and it just made me cringe, and I kind of felt that it maybe was even a little bit distasteful with, and I know that there's an interview that we can talk about with Adam McKay where it was kind of like that he cut a certain scene that would have made this concern of mine less potent, but it's the idea that, okay, so what, are we just making fun of people who are developmentally delayed? So like the quote, non-neurotypical. And so for me, like, I'm going to lean heavy for the purposes of this episode into those soy boy tendencies that I have. And I'm going to let the crowd get really angry with me.
Yeah.
Call me a
Can you just hold on 1 second though? Because I need to switch into a parka because there's snowflakes up there right now.
Exactly.
And while we're taking a break, I want to shout out Dude Abides real quick, who straight out of the gate jumped in the chat with a little donation and yelled, "Do not touch my drumsticks," and then also threw out a great suggestion that Wisecrack should have a trivia night between the Show Me the Meaning and Culture Binge casts. So if there's a little something brewing between you and Michael here, Austin, maybe we can take it out on the
We'll make it a
field.
fundraiser or something. We're saying this right now to everyone. We're going to do it. I'm going to make it happen. It's going to be fun. It'll be great.
Thanks for the idea, Dude Abides.
Dude Abides is the best.
Thank you, Dude Abides. Yeah, we love you. Okay, so before we start peeling things apart, let's do just a brief little recap, and then we'll let Michael and Raymond throw their shade at me for being a softie. Okay, so Brennan and Dale, they're 40-year-old baby men, and when their parents, Robert and Nancy, get married, they're forced to become roommates.
Hold on, this synopsis is already feeling a little judgmental.
Hold on.
He's really coming for us.
Go on.
Let the copywriter read the copy. But of course they clash because they're 40-year-old men who are forced to live together, and they're spoiled brats and they don't like each other, right? So Dale basically gives Brennan the house rules, most notably not to touch his drum set. But of course, Brennan not only rocks out on the drums, chipping one of Dale's drumsticks, but when Dale calls him out on it, he rubs his balls all over the drums, causing them to kick the shit out of each other. Their parents then have to punish them for this because they make a big spectacle in the front yard, and then they force them to find jobs, which doesn't go so well, as they basically sabotage every single interview. Now, when Brennan's successful younger brother Derek comes to the house for dinner, he openly ridicules Dale and Brennan for their lack of ambition, leading Dale to punch Derek. And this really turns Derek's wife on, and she starts up a ridiculously hilarious sexual affair with Dale. Now, meanwhile, Robert and Nancy are planning for their retirement, where they're going to travel the world on their boat. However, Dale and Brennan crash the boat and cause further chaos, which end up leading Robert and Nancy to break up, fully because of Dale and Brennan. It's all their fucking fault. Now, weeks later, Dale and Brennan, they decide that they're going to, get adult, and they get adult jobs, and they start behaving like functioning, quote-unquote, adult members of society, chasing money, 401ks, cars, Range Rovers, all of that stuff. But after a little pep talk from Robert, they realize that they can't give up on their inner dinosaur and that they need to follow their dreams, however childish they might seem. In the end, Robert and Nancy reconcile. Dale and Brennan become besties again. Dale breaks up with Alice to her dismay, and Dale and Brennan run a successful karaoke events business. And then, of course, in the credits, Dale and Brennan get some revenge with the schoolyard bullies that picked on them, the children that picked on them. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start peeling things apart. But before we do, I do want to give a shout out to this week's sponsor, which is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community where you can connect with like-minded individuals and creatives, and where you can explore projects that you're passionate about. And this is what's so cool about Skillshare, because you can unleash your creativity and pursue your passions right from the convenience of your own home. They offer thousands of classes for creative and curious people on topics like iPhone photography, drone filming, editing, classes on improving productivity, video for IG, artivism, etc., etc. Recently, I've started going through their catalog on design, ethical design. If you're interested in user experience and user interface, they've got some really cool things to help you figure out how to create different like persona profiles for if you're going to be developing apps or do anything with front end UX experience stuff. So I've been doing a lot of that. It's really great. They've got amazing stuff out there. Pretty much if you're looking for a class that has to do with creativity, look for something and they'll have it. It's really great. So if you want to explore your creativity and connect with some really cool people, go to Skillshare.com/SMTM. That's Skillshare.com/SMTM, and you can get a free trial of their premium membership. So that's Skillshare.com/SMTM. free trial of the premium membership, or of course you can click the link down below. All right. So let's start peeling things apart here. Raymond, you had something kind of teed up, yeah? Do you want to go ahead and take a swing at it?
What did I have teed up?
Wasn't there something that we were saying before I did the recap that you were like had some ideas that we were going to start peeling apart here? Some of the richer themes?
Well, one thing that I definitely think about I think what I mentioned was that Michael kind of referenced the evolution of Adam McKay's career. Yeah. And this may seem like a bit of a stretch, but I really don't think that's the case. But if you'll follow me, we're going to go on a bit of a ramble.
Let's go.
So Adam McKay's work kind of at this stage in his career has become a lot more explicitly political, really starting with The Big Short, or maybe starting with The Other Guys. I know like the ending credits of The Other Guys is all like essentially a PowerPoint of the housing collapse and how that was all orchestrated. But I think a lot of the stuff that he's been exploring in his later films really in a really explicit way has always kind of been there from his first movie, like the Anchorman movies, probably most obviously, with, you know, these guys who are kind of finding themselves at the turning of a cultural tide and they're absolutely pissed about it. And then, you know, Talladega Nights is all about how like sort of the idea of like family or faith or patriotism papering over people's sort of latent bigotry or xenophobia. And in this movie, I think it fits within that paradigm. It's a little bit more obtuse, but one of the things that I love about this movie is that while Brennan and Dale are fuck-ups, the movie by the end of it is not really endorsing them and their worldview so much as endorsing them as humans and saying that, like, I think ultimately the message of this movie, and it's why, you know, we talked a little bit about Roger Ebert's review of it before getting on mic, and why I disagree with his implication that the movie is really mean-spirited is that this movie, I think, ultimately is saying that, like, some people are just square pegs and they don't fit within the sort of like round holes that have been constructed in like a social way. And that's not their fault. And that it's incumbent on us to like accept people as they are. And that's not to say that, like, you know, all their faults should be forgiven and that people shouldn't be encouraged to grow and mature, but that some people are not like fit to exist within society as a socially constructed sort of concept, if you know what I'm saying. And so it's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but I do genuinely think the ending of this movie is saying that, like, yes, we acknowledge that these guys are immature and entitled, but while they shouldn't feel entitled to, like, become doctors or run big companies or have, you know, a command over a bunch of people, what they should feel entitled to is a sense of support and a sense of structure and a sense of health and safety and security, not because they have earned that, but because they are, despite being fuck-ups, still human, and that all humans should feel entitled to those things. Well, and I do genuinely find that aspect of the movie really beautiful and touching. But sorry, Michael.
No, I think that's really interesting. And like I too, just a really quick reference. There's this book called Improv Nation. I think the author's name is something Wasserman, maybe. But it's this book about the history of improvisational comedy and theater in America. And there's a big chunk about the mid-90s scene in Chicago when a young Adam McKay was a part of the I.O. Theater and Second City Theater in Chicago. And this is a guy who did stuff like, for one of his comedy shows, posted flyers all around the city of Chicago that said Adam McKay is going to kill himself tomorrow. This is not a joke. Had everyone gather around a building and like screamed a bunch of stuff about how life was meaningless, and then threw a dummy modeled after him into the ground. You know, someone who I think has always like wanted to push boundaries and sort of be subversive in his work since he was literally in his early 20s. So I think there is that core there. And I think Raymond's absolutely right to say, you know, one might now be like, holy shit, Adam McKay got super political. But I think he's always had that sort of perspective. But I think, like, to your latter point there, Raymond, that he's not necessarily judging these guys. I think in a sense in this film, in both Anchorman and Talladega Nights, we see men who are kind of pieces of shit, but they get power and influence and think they deserve things. The difference with like Step Brothers is he doesn't want to say these guys should be the president. And I think it's, of course, telling that this movie opens with a quote from then President George W. Bush. But it's almost like saying that like people can be fuck ups or pieces of shit or like the round peg in the square hole, as long as they're not the people that lead society. But of course, we see in sort of Brendan's brother and his corporate friends the type of male entitlement and confidence that Adam McKay is so
they're like the
afraid
masters of the universe sort of archetype that
Yeah.
I think the movie is really kind of critiquing.
Well, and I think he gets at that when there's the scene where Richard Jenkins' character is talking to Mary Steenburgen's character, and he says that Dale said he wants to go into the family business, and she says, "But you're a doctor." And then he says it's all about who you know, and I think that's so apt though, because I think once again think about how many people, especially like dudes that run the world, are in the family business because of who they know. And these are often people, shouts to Succession, right? What is Succession about? Other than unqualified young men who are in the family business because of who they know, having an insane influence on the world. And I think that line is a helpful key in getting at what McKay thinks about these characters and their place in the world.
Yeah, I'm just looking at McKay's filmography, and I wonder if like the collaborations with Will Ferrell and the split with Will Ferrell could be drawn along these lines. And tell me what you guys think. The collaborations with Will Ferrell were like fresh takes or new takes on different cinematic types of stories. So the newsroom story. They're gonna do a fresh take on it. You've got like the hate at first sight, kind of like two families coming together, sort of Brady Bunch, but a horrible Brady Bunch. So this is like a fresh take on it. Then you've got like the Days of Thunder car racing sports film, right? And then the split is that now instead of McKay trying to do like intertextual references explicitly with cinema, he's now looking at like real world events, right? And so for me, there's like a freshness because they aren't just commentaries on the genre of cinema, even though, of course, there's always going to be intertextual references, but it's much more about like, okay, I'm going to lean into satire to explicitly address things in culture, society, kind of very sort of boldly and in your face, which is what you get with Big Short, Vice, Don't Look Up, etc. What do you think that's maybe a good way to kind of map the kind of break there and what he's doing?
Yeah, I can see. I think it's important to note that Adam McKay Will Ferrell is one of the co-producers on Succession. I just wanted to point that out because the way that Austin presented that, it seemed like you were kind of characterizing it as though they had like a rift between the two of them, when in reality, I think they're interested in making different kinds of movies.
I hate to interrupt.
Go ahead, Michael.
They did have a rift. The news broke 2 days ago. Yeah, Adam McKay said in an interview, I saw this in like IndieWire, that recently they literally had a rift because of a project Adam McKay is developing about the Los Angeles Lakers, where Will Ferrell was going to play Dr. Jerry Buss. Then they put John C. Reilly in that role instead. McKay said he went about it in kind of a shitty way, and that's why their production company, Gary Sanchez Productions, broke up.
I didn't know that.
Will Ferrell's not talked to Adam McKay in like 6 months or a year. So it was kind of like sad and kind of oddly apropos to be watching this movie a few days after that news broke.
Well, I didn't realize that, but even so, I think with regards to the movies that we've discussed so far, that does bear mentioning.
Yeah.
But I hope that hasn't caused a rift between him and John C. Reilly. They're a great on-screen duo.
Yeah, and then like going back to that was just kind of like the Adam McKay thing, and there's more to say about McKay because I think he's a really interesting storyteller. But with regards to this film, like the things that I think are the most interesting are kind of like twofold. Like one, that these men both have experienced trauma. Like one, the death of a parent, and one, a divorce at a young age. And so what you get then is you get like what are the effects of familial breakdown? Right? Which I think is something that's really interesting to explore and probably important to explore. And so if I'm going to be as sympathetic as possible and I'm going to kind of like take off my grumpy face, that's one of the really interesting themes. And then I think maybe even the most interesting theme is something that you guys have talked about, is what does it really mean to be an adult, right? And I love the bit at the end where they wear the suit of adulthood, but it's totally a bullshit caricature, right? Like you can hear Will Ferrell be like, "Oh, this was a really productive conversation," blah blah blah. You know, like when they're all at the Catalina wine mixer thing, and then of course the fact that it's Catalina wine mixers, and that's like the most serious thing in the world. It's like, come on, this is ridiculous. And you know, it's also that Derek can make 550K or whatever it was that he made, and make money, right? So there's something about the kind of ludicrous nature of what we value as being mature, which makes that kind of like dinosaur monologue or little speech that Robert gives about how, look, I lost my love, I lost my passion, I lost my joy, I lost my ability to play. And we also have to remember these are all artists that are telling this story. And what's one of the fundamental things they teach you in every acting class, in every writing class, etc., it's about not losing that play, that sense of creativity and childlike wonder in the world. So there's also something beautiful about valuing that. And so I think those kind of the issue of trauma, and then the issue of like, what does it mean to be an adult, and why does this world value adulthood? And there is like socio-political and political economic reasons why we value adulthood and why we devalue the child status of the human experience. So I think that those are really interesting themes that are explored in this film that I do think are really valuable.
Yeah, totally. And it is interesting too that it's a movie about adult children going to live at home. And that was happening 10 years ago, but it's happening much more now than it was then. And I think now it's not always just the weird fuck up sons who move home, but it's lots of people who have tried their best to be adults and have been spat out by the system and have to go live with parents. And I think the movie was kind of forward thinking and like getting at, what do these people do that are lost, that don't fit into, I think, like what you were saying, Austin, the trajectory of adulthood that one is, the boxes one is supposed to check off. And we see what happens when eventually they do that and kind of lose their dinosaur in the process.
Yeah, which is a bullshit narrative, right? Which is like, well, this is what adulthood is. You go to university and you meet a partner and then you have 2.3 children and you get the white picket fence and da-da-da-da-da, right? It's part of this fucking machine. And to challenge it in 2008, this is right before the GFC too, right? So they film in 2007. So now we have an entire generation of people that are even more heavily influenced.
Just for everyone listening, did you mean Great Financial Crisis by GFC? Because it took me a second.
Okay, cool.
Just assuming there's one other listener who's is as slow as me, but just one of you.
Sorry.
I thought it was a football club.
Yeah, but right before the fucking world economy collapsed and the millennial
generation. It is kind of crazy.
Yeah, and the millennial
that
generation
moment sort of chose this movie in a way. Yeah.
Well, and then you have COVID pandemic, and you have all these people. They're calling it the Great Resignation. Have you heard about this? Where people are leaving the job market. I just read this. It hasn't hit Australia yet, but it's hit Europe, Western Europe, and it's hit the United States. But I read this amazing article, and there was this, tenured university professor who I can't remember exactly what her specialty was, but it was something really relevant, and she's producing scientific papers. And she's like, I realized that working from home made me want to have a better work-life balance. And I also wanted to do things that actually impacted the world rather than just reading scientific research papers all day and squabbling with like interdepartmental and interdisciplinary issues ad nauseum. And so she's like, I'm leaving my full tenured professorship because she realized that before she was just chasing a title, and she's like, but those things aren't as important now. So I think there's some really interesting themes that are kind of coming up with this tension about like, what does it even mean to be a fucking adult in the world, and why do we like wear those masks and force that on us,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that on that note, Austin, I think another thing to add to that is that something that actually one of our listeners shouted out in the chat just now. Sky mentioned, given the COVID situation, I could see an entire generation of young folks losing ambition like the Step Brothers. And while I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as such, I do think a lot of folks, given the pandemic or the climate crisis or any number of cascading events that are all like making their lives and livelihoods more tenuous, or untenable rather, I think there is a sort of notion from folks that like, well, this is, if things are going to be like this, do I really, who knows how many like happy years I have left, not just to enjoy my youth, but maybe to enjoy my life in general. And taking stock of things and wanting to really reevaluate what's important. Do I do I want to spend my life like selling helicopters, and how does that really help things, and what does that actually contribute
Well,
to
it's like,
society
yeah,
at the end of the day?
the Dale character says at one point, like, they don't get it. Like, this lifestyle is a choice. And I
Yeah.
think there's something to that, like the fool who accidentally, even if not for the right reasons, sees through the veil of absurdity that modern society is holding there. And I think to broaden out and get back to the movie, of course. But something like Don't Look Up, from what we know of the movie, it's not out yet, so maybe this isn't the case at all. But it's supposedly a movie about two scientists who realize an asteroid's about to destroy the Earth, and no one really cares. Like these two people who are like, guys, there's a thing that's about to happen, and politicians and media figures kind of just don't care and make a spectacle around it. And even you have the same thing in The Big Short, where the main characters there are like seeing what's happening and no one else around them is realizing this. And they see the sort of world collapse around them as they're begging people to see things the way they do. And this is a much sillier, satirical version of that. But it's two people that are out of step with reality, maybe because the reality they live in is kind of bullshit in itself.
Let me translate what Michael just said. Dale and Brennan are prophets. And they are announcing the apocalypse, the revelation of the. Is that what I'm getting from this?
Listen, it's Hanukkah season. I'm feeling a little Old Testament, so yeah. I mean, there's something to that. There's something to that.
Yeah, there is something there. Yeah.
So Austin,
go ahead, Raymond.
I was gonna ask, just to get like on track with the movie itself. Like, you come on here, you kick dirt in both of our faces, you make us lick white dog shit.
Yeah.
Is there anything about this movie that really works for you? Do you think there's a way in for you with this movie, or is it all just kind of top to bottom, kind of turns you off?
It takes me to the end, and the end is when I start to be like, okay, I really like that tension about like them trying to play the adult. And then what happens to me is then it actually kind of like retroactively justifies everything else up to that point. But to me, I don't know if that's always a sign of a successful movie, that I have to wait. Even though it's a nice, 90-minute film, I shouldn't have to wait 60 minutes before I start to be like, okay, cool, now I care. And I think that's what happened to me, is I just didn't care. I felt like it was a little, I don't know, it just was a little mean-spirited. I kind of read the Roger Ebert review that we can talk about now. I know, and I was kind of like, I got that too. Like.
So do you think like the set pieces in the middle, where you do have these like this series of comedic set pieces with their various misadventures, is that where you kind of like tapped out a little bit?
No, for me it was kind of like just the setup. It was the very setup from the beginning. Okay. I think that there are funny moments, like almost like sketches, like scenes that are funny, like the Catherine Hahn scene when she's talking about like wanting to get Dale up inside her vagina, and like I think that's funny, right? Like some of it's not funny, like when Derek goes up to the treehouse, that as a sketch, like I don't really think that's funny, but you get it, because then Dale punches him, and then that's when Brennan and Dale become friends, and then that's what creates the attraction, with Derek. So like it's important for the story, but like moments don't always work. And then I don't know, I thought that some of the language was problematic, and I just don't really think that that's excusable.
I hear you on that. I think there's the one degree of nuance that I will lend it is that aren't like the problematic instances of like inappropriate nomenclature being used are both being used by Derek, who is unequivocally painted as like the bad guy.
Derek,
the two brothers,
and then
the brothers,
right?
The brothers do too.
They don't say the F slur.
Oh, I don't.
I don't think the brothers say the F slur at all.
No,
I think they say the R slur at one point.
They drop the R bomb. Yeah, which to me, like, listen, my dad was a special needs teacher. My aunt is non-neurotypical, and it's like, so I just grew up. To me, that word, even before it became like a cultural thing, I just grew up. I was like, that fucking sucks, And I've written articles on like the social model of disability. So it's just one of those things that, particularly for me, is like a red flag. So for me, I'm like, I just don't take it. And then I tuned in real heavily, and I was talking with my partner about it. We were like talking real much. Is this kind of like mocking developmental delay, right? And then I read that article that our producer Matt sent us, that Adam McKay actually cut a scene And he actually regrets cutting that scene where there's a psychologist that actually it makes it so that we don't lean in too heavily to them being sort of developmentally delayed.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and to be clear, in that scene, they were at the end of it. The doctors were like, "No, you guys are just normal. They're just idiots."
Yeah, exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
So yeah.
And I
that
feel,
is
yeah. Go ahead.
something I had alluded to before when I was talking about some of my other favorite comedies, though. I think that is, even if they don't explicitly state it, there's never like a gross characterization of like I think people talk about this with the another John C. Reilly character, Dr. Steve Brule. Like the conversation with that is maybe a little bit more pressing because there is a weird characterization that he's playing. But it never seemed to me like, my takeaway from, like I said, movies like this is always like, no, these are just really stupid people. They're just like total, like cartoonishly goofy in a way.
Yeah,
and it kind of reminds me of. Do you remember that TikTok trend where everyone was like, "How do I know that my partner won't cheat on me?" And it was always like some like attractive woman who's dating like a nerdy guy, and it'd be like, "This is how I know my partner won't cheat on me." And then it would cut to like him with his Star Wars collection or his DVD collection, and it was always like mocking like these people that actually care about things that maybe are into like nerddom or fandom, and it just felt like kind of shitty, like
trend.
Yeah, it was supposed to be funny, right? Like, that's how I know my partner won't cheat on me because they're just a fucking nerd and no one would want to have sex with them, Like, so they couldn't even get it.
Cool thing to say about a person.
They won't cheat on me because they're just a gross piece of shit.
What are they saying about themselves there? That's kind of the...
And it was like, I don't know. It just felt like, oh, okay, so because somebody has like a nerd tendency, like therefore they're not cool enough, they're not sexy enough, they're not adult enough, they're not mature enough, so they're undesirable. And I don't know, it just felt shitty to me. And I know I am leaning heavy into the snowflake here, but fuck it, I'm gonna play that role for this tendency.
No, I understand all of that, and it's certainly not to excuse any of the aspects that have dated poorly. I think that it comes back to that notion of I remember having a discussion with a friend of mine about similar aspects of representation and slurs being used in movies. And I think in this movie, it is certainly a bit more problematic because a lot of the time those sort of slurs are being used as punchlines or they're being used to humorous effect. But I remember talking to him and he said something that kind of stuck with me, which was that anytime you hear someone use a hurtful word like that, it always should say more about that character than about the character that they are referring to with that word.
Yeah.
Like in the movie should be clear about how it's depicting that sort of language and
I think
not
in the final scene at the Catalina wine mixer, I think there's an example of that when Derek realizes he loves his brother and they start to hug, but Derek first pulls back like he's going to hit him and starts calling him the F slur. And I think in that instance, it's just like, oh, this guy is so fucked up that he can't fathom like hugging his own brother without using a homophobic slur because male intimacy to him is this horrifying thing. And I also think I like the sort of metric you just explained there, Raymond. But I also think with comedies and especially stuff from this era, I just tend to evaluate stuff on what work, where that person's work has gone. And I do think like there are people from that early 2000s era that made comedies like that never veered away, never, you know what I mean? Never progressed, never grew. And I do think it's like with people in the Adam McKay extended universe, it's been cool to see those people like remain curious and kind of change and grow. And I don't think the type of stuff we saw in Step Brothers, you see in a lot of work from these people later on. So in my mind, I still find that to be a cool sign about that crew. It's total. Everything you're saying, Austin, I think is totally valid and legit. But for me, I guess it's at least beneficial to know now that the work these people are doing is not, indicative of that sort of attitude, and that they've seemingly have grown and been pretty thoughtful about their art.
And to even contradict myself, like the most charitable and compassionate reading of this, let's be dialectical here to use like philosophical ideas, is that actually at the same time, in using this quote unquote problematic language, they're obviously intentionally highlighting that when people are doing that, that Derek is a shithead, that he sucks, and that everything that he
Absolutely.
represents, that certain type of adult, masculine, like homophobic dude, that whole structure of being an adult is shitty and it should be critiqued, and that even when these guys are dropping the L slur, that in itself is also something that is shitty, and that they are just maybe undereducated, and that they need, so there's obviously an intentional highlighting of that kind of contradiction. So that's the most charitable reading, is to be like, oh yeah, okay, so we can watch this and we can be like, there's room for growth and improvement. So I think that's, in some ways, it's also, I mean, but this is also why I think when things are problematic, a lot of times they're problematic insofar as they reveal certain tensions that are rife for unpacking and exploring. So
I'm curious on the note that we've talked about the Roger Ebert review. We've alluded to this a few times. We need to post it on the SMTM Twitter.
Yeah.
But we've talked about how he characterizes the film as mean-spirited. Maybe not ideologically. I don't think he digs too much into that, but he talks about the violence in it. And for me, one of the things that I love about this movie is that it treats violence the same way like a Tom and Jerry cartoon does, which is like, you know, at no time do you genuinely feel that these guys are in mortal danger. Like, Brennan gets smushed between a falling bunk bed and another bed. And
I mean, Dale gets buried alive
on
at one point.
And he pushes out like a zombie. Like, there is this wonderful energy to it that does genuinely feel like kids playing in a sandbox. Like, oh, I'm gonna bury you alive. Well, I'm gonna punch out like a zombie, and you can't kill me. I'm invincible.
I mean, at one point they say, "Do you want to go do karate in the garage?" That's what they would say if you're 10 or 11 and you're at like a family friend's or a cousin's house, and you wait till like the niceties happen, and you're just like, hey, do you want to go in the garage and like kick pumpkins and put Mentos and Diet Coke? And it's just like, yes, I do.
Yeah. There is that wonderful sense of, like, whether you want to call it in the parlance of the film, like maintaining their dinosaur or retaining their dinosaur, or whatever it is, like seeing, I know that it's very man-child, and that like the Apatows and McKays of the world at this point in film history sort of had the market cornered on, you know, men behaving like boys. But there is, like, despite the problematic aspects of this that you've noted, Austin, there is a kind of like innocence and a purity to the way that these guys interact with the world. Like they aren't cynical at all. There are so many aspects of this that are like obviously really stupid, but they're earnest, and that's kind of what makes them so funny, is that like from the beginning, the game of one-upsmanship of like, you have to call me Dragon, well, you have to call me Nighthawk, and you can see like the wheels turning in his head of like, what's cooler than Dragon? Like, just little things like that. There is a weird honesty to this that they capture quite well. It's almost akin to Tom Hanks in Big or something like that, where like just being able to capture that sort of childlike innocence within it. One of my favorite moments in the movie that is, I think, kind of inspired in a weird way, is the way that Brennan is sitting in the back seat while his mom is driving him to meet the Dobaks for the first time.
Not gonna call him
just
Dad.
one of
I don't, even if there's a fire.
Not even if there's a fire. Like, the way that they qualify things exactly like that is like, they think about things in the context of like PSAs or instructional videos that they watched as children in a classroom of like what to do in case of a fire or an emergency. I love those little notes throughout the film that are kind of just peppered in.
And I do think, you know, it's interesting just to really quickly to compare it to some of the other comedies of that era, let's say like in Old School or like a Wedding Crashers, kind of like the Todd Phillips world. All the main dudes in those movies were like, we watch it now and it's like, oh, they're low key just being like rape rips. And I'm not trying to be silly. Like these movies are just like dark when you really look at what the protagonists are doing, how they talk about people. And here there's like an innocence and an earnestness to their absurdity and their transgressive behavior, which I think stands the test of time better than some of those other films from that era.
Is that one of the contemporaries that you were talking about earlier, that you think that they haven't really evolved, like Todd Phillips films, that they haven't evolved as much as like the Adam McKay universe?
Think they have. I mean, I've watched many of those films within recent years, and it's kind of a bit of a bummer. There's scenes in those movies where you're like, when I was in high school, I laughed a lot at this, but
Yeah.
this feels bad.
Is
And I would say
Apatow?
the
What about the Apatow films? Where do they fit in this for you? Are they a part of the McKay extended
Oh,
universe?
I definitely think Apatow. I mean, didn't Apatow produce this?
yeah,
Yeah.
I
he
know
was
that
involved with it. Yeah.
they overlapped pretty regularly, and I think that your mileage may vary with some of Apatow's recent output, but I certainly think that he has continued to evolve as an artist, and I also applaud his work as a producer. That he's helped so many young artists realize their potential on screen, whether through like helping them develop shows on HBO, or helping bring their movies to fruition, stuff like that. He's been a really great ace in the hole for a lot of up and coming filmmakers, and I think that his own work has reflected that sort of generosity, that he's surrounding himself with new talent, with new ideas, and he's always kind of expanding his notion of what constitutes art, or at least with regards to the stories that he wants to tell.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Roger Ebert review. Michael, I know you were saying that you're usually a fan of Ebert, but so he focuses on like the mean-spiritedness of this. I'll be honest, when I read the article, I kind of found it a little bit nonsensical. I really didn't get what his issue was, and he kind of makes this remark.
He saw another movie.
Yeah, and it was kind of like, he's like, listen, I like funny things. Remember that time that I wrote that X-rated film and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, maybe he was just jaded. Like, it was a very strange review to me. And then he's very cryptic about, like, he's like, oh, there's a similar joke that is made in a Jack Black movie, was a Tropic Thunder, that Jack Black makes, but it works in that film and it doesn't work here. What's the joke?
Yeah, what film has aged better? I think it's...
In Tropic Thunder, Jack Black is tied to a tree, and he says, like, if you untie me, I will literally suck your dick. And then he goes into graphic detail about the process of doing that. But I didn't know how that. I was trying to think of what the joke in Step Brothers was that he insisted was like a one-to-one.
Joke.
Yeah. Rob Riggle says he would eat his dick,
like Kobayashi. That was the only one that I could think of.
But I don't know. It's like interesting that he wrote that in 2008, and like more people are going to watch Step Brothers long after they watch Tropic Thunder, which has Robert Downey Jr. in blackface. But I think that it is interesting because there's a lot of examples in history of really good film critics that are really bad at writing about comedy. And I think there's a lot of examples of really great comedy films that in their time just didn't get that level of critical praise. And it's weird. I don't know why that's the case. Maybe it's because a lot of comedy films don't involve story structure and emotional stakes, maybe in the same way that some other films do. A lot do, but it's just interesting to read a film critic who's so good on so many films and who just thinks this movie is total trash.
Well, who knows? I mean, a lot of it comes down to taste. Like if you there's that great documentary about Roger Ebert, Life Itself, named after his memoir. And there's a clip in that where he says like, so it's a thumbs up for Benji and a thumbs down for the Kubrick film, referring to Full Metal Jacket. Yeah. And it's just one of those things where like, a lot of it comes down to taste. I think there was another episode where you're saying like, I'm wagging my tail for Garfield or whatever. Like, people like what they like. And I think one of the things that's so great about the review, whether or not we agree with him, Michael, is that like we talked about this in the Telegram exchange after you shared that with us, that like he and Gene Siskel were so great at it's that thing that great film criticism should do, which is that like whether they like it or not, they make you interested in seeing it, and they make you interested in being part of the conversation. And I think that's why he was one of the greats, not because he has perfect taste.
Oh, for sure.
This is what's so important, I think, for us to like really just keep harping on, that film criticism is not the same as like cancellation. So we live in a world now where it's like, oh, something makes you feel icky, it's bad, don't watch it, it's gone. No. Like, I have so much fun talking with you guys about films that I don't like. I have so much fun talking. I went and saw a film at the Sydney Film Fest, and it was the new Jane Campion film, Power of the Dog. I didn't love the film, but the conversation afterwards was so much fun. So this is something that I think is so important about art, right? Is that it isn't icky bad, never talk about it, fuck you, you're an idiot for liking it, or like, oh my god, it's the greatest thing in the world, I'm going to identify with it and now it's going to become part of my identity. It's got to exist in some other dimension
Yeah,
of
but
like
but
what it
that's the
is.
metric that you're pointing out, which is important. I think art, whether we individually like it or not, if it can lead to interesting conversation and debate, then at least it's art that's trying to do something right. It's the
Yeah.
bad art is like, we go see the movie together and walk out and it's like, oh yeah, that just sucked. And there's nothing to say because it was just like bad. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like I think there does exist, literature and plays and films and visual art that do that. But I think you're totally right, Austin. And that's what people that are interesting when they talk about films are interesting because they're able to identify the ideas that are happening there and have something to say about them. So
it's that
amen.
kind of like plague of mediocrity that you see a lot of the time when a movie doesn't take any real big risks. I would much rather see a movie. My friend Rashawn, who's been on Show Me the Meaning a few times, he always talks about how like he would much rather see someone strike out while aiming for the fences than see someone just kind of like, I don't know, just like bunt one and maybe like sacrifice it for someone to advance to second. I think the analogy falls apart, but. It is just one of those things where like, yeah, you do kind of lose something with all the sort of like focus grouping and studioifying of art. Like there has to be someone in the chat. Liam Narin said there is actually an idea I've heard a few times that only someone with a childlike way of handling the world can actually create anything new, and our society seems built to snuff that out. And I think that's definitely a theme that's at play with this movie, but you can also take a look at the film industry as a whole, and you're always going to see those sort of those two poles at war with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Austin.
I was just going to say a lot of philosophers talk about like the revolutionary spirit as insisting within youth or the eyes of the youth or the impetus of the youth. And there's a reason for that. It's because you don't have as much time to have been beaten down by the pressures of the world to pay a mortgage and to survive, and you haven't seen as much, and so you still do have a little bit of the idealism. And if you can maintain that in your artistic creativity, in your personal life, and there's a lot of value in it. So yeah.
Well, and I'm allowed to use this word because Austin said it earlier, but I think with art, as in philosophy, there's this like meta dialectical process by which the best philosophers, in my humble opinion, are people that if you read their entire oeuvre, might change their mind or progress what they think because their work is always in dialectical relation with the world around them and the progression of thought around them. And there's always people, philosophers, other academics, who one might say they had one idea when they were 32 years old and they wrote that over and over until they were 80. And I think filmmakers can be like that as well. And I think it's interesting. And I do think McKay has done a good job of this. He's someone that has had a dialectical relation to the world around him, artistically, politically, who he works with, what he thinks matters. And I think that's important. And I do think that the best comedy creators do that, and the worst comedy creators think that what they thought was funny in 1998 is the only thing that's funny, and them and their friends, as they get old and lose their hair, I can say that, they still just like hover around that one circle because they're in a non-dialectical relationship with the culture, society, world around them.
Can we take a minute and can you just talk with us? I mean, you're the comedy maestro here. Can we talk about like who are some of the best comedic creators at the moment? And because is Step Brothers your favorite comedy film, or is it like just in the top echelon? And can you talk about like what else is up there
for me?
for
It's top echelon because we don't really make good comedy movies anymore. There's movies that come out that are funny, but we had an era where someone like an Adam McKay could make a really funny movie. There was an era where Superbad, got made, and things like that just don't, mid-level comedies don't get made. I think that, we say about dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, life finds a way, and comedy finds a way. And I think comedy's become much more of a television medium than it is a cinematic medium these days, in my humble opinion. There are very funny movies that come out still. But yeah, so I don't know. And I think that a lot of the best stuff, things I like, we've talked about this before. I've talked about this maybe on this podcast. We've talked about this with Raymond, but people like Connor O'Malley, I find to be rip-roariously funny in the way they make comedy that's on the internet, that's about the internet, that's exploring in a way that's very similar to Step Brothers, but in a dark way. Connor O'Malley, someone who wants to ask, like, what is in the psyche of some of the weirdest Americans? Whether these are people who are kind of infected by the psyche of like hyper capitalism, or those that have a sort of like fascist leaning nationalism in them, or sort of like a masculinity that starts to break their brains. And I think he's someone who like might not ever get a TV show or movie made, but is used the internet to do that in really cool ways. Yeah.
I think Tim Robinson is another example, who's kind of in the same orbit. And certainly on the other side of things, I think Joe Pera has been doing some incredible work, who is kind of like the complete opposite side of the spectrum from a Connor O'Malley or Tim Robinson. His comedy is much more quiet, but he has this great energy about him, and his approach to his work is almost kind of like being sort of a contemporary Mr. Rogers in a cynical world, and just kind of like almost seeing how that personality type can exist like unharmed and undaunted.
It's a non-ironic earnestness, which we don't see a lot of.
Absolutely.
And I will just say, we're throwing out. Oh no, go ahead. Finish talking about Joe Pera.
Oh no, I was just going to pivot to say an actor that I think like Will Ferrell, Adam McKay, and them walked so that he and his co-creator could run. I would say Jody Hill and Danny McBride are a great comedic duo who very clearly, I mean, they kind of owe their careers to Adam McKay and Will Ferrell, who put them on after seeing Foot Fist Way. But you can definitely see the seeds of a Kenny Powers or like his Righteous Gemstones character in like Ricky Bobby in Talladega Nights. I think if that movie got made today, it would 100% be a Danny McBride vehicle.
Yeah, and the last person I'll throw out, as we're doing a bunch of names for anyone who's listening, Patty Harrison. Patty Harrison is one of the funniest comedians working. She does stand up. She's in, I Think You Should Leave, and some of the best sketches there, and wrote for it. She got kicked off of Twitter for being very funny, just
for being extremely funny.
Yeah, for just being, it was the funniest reason kicked off Twitter. But yeah, and I think these are all people that like are relating to the current cultural moment and responding to it in really interesting and thoughtful ways. And I think that McKay, we could trace a lot of that back to that McKay moment, because when you read the oral history of Step Brothers that The Ringer put out a few years ago, a thing a few people note, and some of the actors that worked on it, is that by working with him, they noted that Adam McKay is very subversive and intellectual, and someone who has ideas and wants to make comedy that reflects the culture. And I think, like you said, I think that crew walked so a lot of really interesting people could run right now.
So
it is a shame that more movies like this don't get made, but go on, Austin.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, as we're kind of winding things down, what do you think this means for the future of comedy? Kind of like final thoughts here. Like, Michael, you said that in a few years' time, we're still going to be talking about Step Brothers. We're not going to be talking about Tropic Thunder. Like, what is it that makes this film have any lasting power? Kind of like, what do we think, wrapping this up? What is the future for comedy, this kind of comedy? Has it moved to TV, online exclusively? Is there room for comedies to be made on streaming services, maybe direct to streaming services? Like, is this also a shift in the landscape, that kind of the distribution landscape and our consumption of media landscape, that kind of has affected where and how these types of vehicles are being produced? What do we think?
I mean, I would just quickly say, I do think I don't know if we're going to get back to that era where you have comedic auteurs and that sort of, like we talked about, like the early 2000s, the Apatow, Todd Phillips, Adam McKay era, of course, just all white bros. But I don't know if we're going to get back to that, but I think it's going to be a lot more, most of the people that Raymond and I just mentioned aren't a part of massive projects, but do very specific things. And I think comedy's gotten a lot more specific. And there's a lot of like subgenres and worlds in comedy, and I think that's going to keep happening. But I think it looks a little bit more like indie music than pop music. And I think there was an era in the 2000s where comedy was pop music, and I think it's returned to an era where it has more of that indie, almost artsy vibe to it. But I would feel unprepared to predict what the next school of comedy or group of comedians would be who go pop. Don't know what it would be.
Before I turn it over to Raymond real quick, it's interesting. I love that like indie versus pop thing. When I was younger, like I kind of remember when a big comedy film would come out, like that it was almost like a cultural event, right? American Pie, Nutty Professor. I mean, I was young for it, but Beverly Hills Cop 3, like I used to watch it. Like to me, it was like it felt really important when these films came out, and then like going back and watching like Coming to America. Like there was a time in the 80s, 90s, 2000s where it felt like a cultural event when one of these films came out. And now the only cultural events are the big, like 3-hour epics. And so it's kind of just interesting that things have changed. But I will say this, it was really refreshing when I pushed play and I saw that it was only 90 minutes long. And I'm like, wow, a 90-minute movie. I haven't seen an hour-and-a-half movie in fucking ages. So that was really
Love it. Love a 90-minute movie.
Raymond, turn it over to you for the final thoughts, man.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of touched on this in our Eternals episode. This just isn't really the kind of movie that studios are all that interested in making anymore because they go high risk, high reward. They want a $1 billion grand slam every time out of the gate. So yeah, I agree with Michael. There's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening in the streaming world. A lot of that stuff has moved to TV, and it actually doesn't cost a whole lot of money to be funny. So you've seen some really, really funny independent films come out in the past few years, or at least movies that may have a little bit bigger budget sometimes, but are still in sort of the independent mode. Movies like Booksmart or Jim Cummings, who's a filmmaker who's made a handful of really, really funny films. He's kind of a figure in the Danny McBride mold who's always messing with ideas of like fractured masculinity. He did a movie called Thunder Road, Wolf of Snow Hollow, that's really, really funny. So yeah, I mean, I'm comedy is always going to be around. It may be distributed in weird ways, but Austin, you've talked a lot about stuff like TikTok on here and things like that. It is so crazy to me how like I'm not on TikTok, but every once in a while a video will kind of get bumped into my Twitter feed, and it's amazing the ingenuity and the creativity on display from like kids, like 10 or 12-year-olds who just pick up their phone and have just a natural understanding of like comedic rhythm and how a joke should be structured and stuff like that. Like, there's always going to be good stuff out there. Might just be a little bit more difficult to find.
All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap that up. We love you out there. Normally, we would go back into the mailbag at the end of an episode, but last week we did our full mailbag episode where we went through like 20 of your questions and voicemails in email, voicemail form, and it was great. So we just don't have too many things to dig through at the moment to answer. So make sure you reach out to us, shoot us your emails. You can do that at movies@wisecrack.co. That's movies@wisecrack.co. Or you can call us and leave us a voicemail at 1-213-534-8807. That's 1-213-534-8807. Make sure to keep your voicemails as short and concise as possible so we can play them on air and answer them. That's it. Everybody, where can we find you on the internet? Michael.
Michael O'Burns on Twitter, Michael O'Burns with some underscores around the O's on Instagram. I'm on Wisecrack all the time. And if you're looking at Wisecrack stuff, check out the new shows we're making and let us know what you think. Let us know what's working, what you'd like to see. Shoot us an email, hit me up on Twitter or whatever. But yeah, do that. Thanks.
Yeah. I like the hot take game that you started, the one that you did with our horse is the worst animal, where Helen had to defend if horses were the worst animal, and you had your panel of people like arguing back. I like that new show. It's great.
Yeah, we'll do a doc one day about the chaotic making of that, but not yet.
Oral history
in 10 years.
Our horse is the worst animal.
Perfect. All right, Raymond, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd. I'm at Crematoria. Feel free to stop by and say hello.
I had somebody reach out to me on Insta, and I get this a lot. People asking me for like recommendations on movies, films, TV shows, books, things like that. And I've actually just been pointing people for movie recommendations to Raymond's Letterboxd. So
have you really?
Yeah.
That's good advice. I love it.
Follow if you want reviews or recommendations or what. Go to Raymond's Letterboxd and just get on Letterboxd and find other people that you like their take on things, and that's how you can find good recommendations.
Or
So
just buzz me on Twitter if you need recommendations. I think a few listeners bit off more than they could chew, because anytime someone asks me for recommendations, I'm like, here's 15 tweets worth.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. And I'm Austin Hayden. You can find me on Twitter, Insta, all that good stuff. We're going to get out of here. Raymond, will you send us out, brother?
Goodbye from the fucking Catalina wine mixer.